6 decades, France maintained control over its former colonies through a combination of military interventions, economic strangleholds, political puppetry, and cultural influence. However, that era is coming to an end. One by one, nations are taking back their sovereignty by expelling French troops and military bases, abandoning the French-backed CFA franc currency, strengthening alliances with Russia, China,
It was released earlier today. It says that in 2022, at least 435 tons of gold were smuggled out of Africa. 435 tons. That's more than 1 ton of gold every day.
Dubai has been exploiting Africa's gold. But who's behind this masterminded heist? If you think it's just one nation, you're mistaken.
To the president.
What happens when the empire that once drew borders in Africa can't even draw a budget line at home? What happens when the same France that sent troops to silence African voices now finds its own streets roaring louder than cannon fire? A government has fallen, a president is cornered, and the whispers in Paris all trace back to the one place France never expected: Africa. But if you think this collapse was just about numbers on a page, you're not ready for the truth.
War in Ukraine has hammered Europe. Macron's dreams of leading the continent lie in tatters. His grip on domestic power has weakened because of the poorly thought-out election that he conducted last year. And farmers are protesting all over France. Everywhere you look, there's chaos. You would think it couldn't get any worse. But somehow, Macron has managed to create even more trouble for himself. The French president did it again yesterday, another classic foot-in-the-mouth moment where he casually insulted a bunch of African nations.
Africa has long been a foreign policy priority for President Macron, but it's now Africa that's deciding what sort of relationship that it wants with France, the former colonial power. Where does Russia fit into all of this? Where does China fit into all of this too? We've got loads to discuss today with 3 expert panelists on Inside Story. Come and join the conversation wherever you watch Al Jazeera, on TV, online, or on YouTube.
France had always believed its influence in Africa was permanent, woven into the very soil of the continent through decades of mining contracts, military bases, and political ties. But the world had changed faster than Paris expected. A new wave of unity had swept across Africa, driven by a generation unwilling to accept the old model of extraction that left their land rich but their people poor. And when the first African nation announced the immediate expulsion of European mining companies, the shock in France was so sharp it felt almost unreal. The news spread like wildfire. Across Europe, analysts scrambled to interpret what was happening. For decades, French firms had controlled cobalt in Congo, uranium in Niger, gold in Mali, and rare earth minerals scattered across the Sahel belt. The contracts had been crafted in the years after independence, long, complex agreements that always seemed to benefit one side more than the other. African leaders had complained for years, but no one expected the sudden, unified sweep of expulsions that unfolded across the continent. It began in Niger when the government revoked uranium mining licenses held by French companies. Security forces escorted European workers out of the mining zones within hours. The action was bold, startling, and symbolic. For decades, uranium from Niger had powered France's nuclear energy grid, lighting homes, factories, government, buildings, and high-speed trains. Suddenly, that supply chain was gone. France's energy ministry went into emergency meetings as soon as the news broke. Without Niger's uranium, France's reactors were vulnerable, and the nation faced a potential energy shortage not seen since the oil crisis of the 1970s. But the situation grew worse when Mali canceled dozens of gold and lithium contracts. Then Congo, the cradle of the world's cobalt supply, announced that all foreign mining concessions, especially those signed under unequal conditions, were under immediate review and likely termination. Within a week, the shockwave reached Paris with full force. Markets reacted violently. The stock value of major French mining firms plummeted, investors panicked, pension funds linked to mining profits were shaken. French news outlets broadcast articles warning of an impending industrial crisis. Long-standing assumptions about Africa as a secure and dependent market vanished overnight. The French government tried to project calm, insisting that diplomatic channels were open, but the truth was unavoidable. Africa was making a decisive break after decades of frustration, and there was nothing Paris could do quickly enough to stop the momentum. African nations, once divided by borders drawn during colonial eras, were now coordinating their actions. Summits were held in Addis Ababa, Abuja, Dakar, and Lusaka. The message was the same everywhere. Africa would no longer allow its minerals to be extracted without accountability, fair pricing, and ownership stakes that reflected their true value. As France scrambled, Africa surged with newfound confidence. In Luanda, officials announced the creation of a continental mineral pricing board designed to regulate the sale of cobalt, gold, uranium, and rare earths. In Kinshasa, the government unveiled a massive partnership with Asian and South American firms to build Africa-owned processing plants, removing Europe's historical monopoly on mineral refinement. In Bamako, crowds filled the streets carrying banners calling for sovereignty and control over natural wealth. The movement spread from capital to capital like a fire that could not be contained. France watched these developments with growing dread. Entire sectors of its economy relied on cheap African minerals. Without cobalt and rare earths, its electric vehicle industry would collapse. Without uranium, its energy grid faced destabilization. Without African gold and manganese, its industrial sector would struggle. And without access to newly discovered lithium deposits in East and Southern Africa, France would be cut out of the future of global battery production. The crisis was no longer distant, it was national. Inside French factories, workers grew anxious as production slowed. Managers warned that without new mineral supply lines, layoffs were inevitable. The government attempted to negotiate with African states, but the new African leadership bloc refused to bend. They insisted on a new era of economic justice, one where Africa determined how much its resources were worth and who could extract them, and under what conditions. The political climate in France grew volatile. Protests erupted in several cities as citizens demanded answers. Why had the government allowed national industries to rely so heavily on resources it did not control? Why had it taken African grievances for granted? Why had it assumed that the old relationships would remain stable forever? For years, France had acted as though Africa needed it more than it needed Africa. Now the opposite was true, but the shift in Africa was not purely economic. It was deeply psychological. Young Africans saw their nations finally taking control of industries long dominated by outsiders. University students held debates about sustainable development and equitable partnerships. Local miners, long mistreated under foreign-run operations, celebrated the turnover of sites to domestic companies. African engineers returned from abroad to join state-owned enterprises expanding at a record pace. What France saw as panic, Africa saw as an awakening. The transition, however, was not without challenges. African states had to navigate complex issues, technical capacity gaps, financial risks, and security concerns in mining regions. But for the first time, they confronted these challenges from a position of ownership rather than dependency. Foreign partners from Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America offered to assist in building new infrastructure without demanding exploitative concessions. Africa embraced diversification with determination. Meanwhile, Europe faced an uncomfortable truth. Its decades-long access to cheap minerals had been an artificial advantage, not an inherent right. The collapse of that system exposed just how fragile its industries were. Factories halted production. Energy costs soared. Politicians panicked. Analysts warned that if Africa continued to restructure its resource management, Europe's technological and industrial future was at risk. Yet even in crisis, France tried one final diplomatic push. A large delegation traveled to West and Central Africa seeking renegotiation. They arrived with promises of fairer contracts, higher royalties, and new partnerships. But African leaders, calm and resolute, made their position clear. The era of Europe dictating terms was over. Africa would now choose its partners based on equality, transparency, and respect. The delegation returned to Paris empty-handed. The French public, aware of the implications, braced for deeper economic pain. Already, rolling energy shortages were predicted. Automobile companies delayed the release of new electric models. High-tech manufacturers warned of supply bottlenecks. The country realized that its prosperity had rested for too long on a foundation that was never built to last. Across Africa, the new momentum created something even more powerful than economic reform: unity. Nations that once competed for foreign investment now cooperated on shared resource strategies. A continental minerals bank was announced. Joint security forces protected mining zones. Cross-border transport networks were expanded to move refined metals between regional markets. Africa was no longer the continent of raw extraction, it was becoming the continent of value creation. And France, once confident in its privileged access, now stood at a crossroads. Would it adapt to this new reality or cling to the past? Would it finally acknowledge Africa as a global partner rather than an economic lifeline? The panic in Paris made one thing clear. Europe had underestimated the strength of a united Africa. For decades, African nations had endured exploitation, unequal contracts, and political pressure. They had watched their minerals power industries countenance away while their own communities remained underdeveloped. Now they had said enough. France felt the consequences immediately, but the deeper impact was global. Other European nations, fearing similar expulsions, rushed to renegotiate their own mining contracts before it was too late. Analysts declared the end of the era of cheap African minerals. Global commodity markets shifted. Cobalt and uranium prices surged. Investors pivoted toward Africa's emerging mineral industrial sector. Through it all, Africa stood firm. France's panic was loud, disorganized, desperate. Africa's response was calm, strategic, confident. As the world watched, a simple truth emerged, one that had been ignored for generations. The global economy depended on Africa far more than anyone had admitted. And now that Africa had taken control of its destiny, no nation especially, France would ever be able to exploit its wealth without consequence again. The news broke in the early hours, first whispered across dusty border towns, then shared in crowded markets, and finally announced across the world with the force of a political earthquake. Several African nations, long considered central pillars of European mining operations, had issued coordinated orders for all European mining. Companies to halt operations, vacate their concessions, and leave the continent within weeks. What made the announcement thunder across continents was not just its clarity, but its unity. For the first time in modern history, multiple nations across West, Central, and Southern Africa had spoken with one voice. They accused foreign miners, particularly European firms, of decades of exploitation, environmental ruin, and economic extraction disguised as partnership. France, which held some of the most significant mining stakes on the continent, was thrown into immediate panic. In Paris, emergency meetings erupted inside ministries and boardrooms. Analysts flipped through decades of contracts, searching for legal loopholes or diplomatic leverage. Executives from companies tied to uranium, gold, bauxite, cobalt, and rare earth extraction demanded government intervention. Generals spoke in hushed tones about the strategic implications. Without African minerals, entire French industries from nuclear energy to battery manufacturing would face collapse. Yet despite their alarm, Africa wasn't listening. For decades, the continent had carried the weight of unequal resource deals, soil scarred by open pits, rivers polluted by toxic runoff, villages displaced with little compensation, and national treasuries receiving only a fraction of the wealth buried beneath their land. They remembered promises of development that never arrived. Infrastructure projects that stalled halfway, and environmental pledges ignored the moment political pressure eased. The expulsion was not an outburst. It was the culmination of slow-burning frustration, rising political consciousness, and the growing realization that Africa's minerals were the key to the world's technological future. As global industries shifted toward green energy, electric vehicles, advanced electronics, and nuclear power, African nations recognized their leverage: lithium, cobalt, manganese, bauxite, nickel, rare earths, and uranium. And this time, they were determined to redefine the rules. Across the continent, scenes of change played out dramatically. In desert mining outposts, European supervisors found themselves facing local security forces delivering sealed orders. In forest-rich regions, communities gathered at mine gates, celebrating an announcement they had dreamed of for generations. Journalists flocked to mining towns. They found residents quietly joyous, recounting years of seeing trucks roll out loaded with minerals while their schools remained without electricity and their hospitals lacked basic equipment. Elders spoke of land taken for exploration, leaving behind craters and dust. Young people spoke of wanting industries, training centers, and clean water, not promises. In Western media, the narrative was different. Headlines warned of economic warfare, destabilization, and growing influence from non-European nations anxious to fill the void. Commentators speculated that Africa was aligning with rising global powers in a new multipolar world. Others insisted that the expulsion was a temporary gesture of political expression that would soon be reversed. But on the continent, the resolve was unwavering. Meetings among African ministers revealed a clear blueprint. Rather than exporting raw minerals, they sought to build refining plants, metallurgical institutes, battery factories, and regional processing centers. They envisioned a future where African minerals powered African industries and exported finished products, not just ore. For the first time in modern history, they were ready to industrialize. On their own terms, France attempted to respond through diplomacy, sending envoys who spoke of partnership, development, shared history, and global stability. But the nations had grown accustomed to these speeches and weary of them. The leaders of the mineral-rich countries spoke plainly. They would negotiate only on new terms: equal ownership, transparent contracts, environmental safeguards, technology transfer, and local value addition. No more secret agreements, no more symbolic investments, no more lopsided deals. European mining firms balked. Some threatened legal action, others warned of economic retaliation, but their leverage was fading. Global demand for Africa's rare minerals was too high for any one region to control, and new partners eager, well-funded, and more respectful were already sending delegations. Within weeks, mining sites once dominated by European firms were cordoned off. African engineers conducted assessments of the machinery and deposits left behind. Plans for national mineral companies began to take shape. Environmental scientists arrived to study contaminated sites, preparing long-overdue cleanup projects. France continued. Too real. Its energy sector panicked over the potential loss of uranium supplies. Tech companies worried about rare earth shortages. Diplomats scrambled to prevent other African nations from joining the expulsion, but the shockwaves could not be contained. One African nation after another began auditing old mining contracts. Some imposed new royalty structures. Others announced moratoriums on foreign licenses until reforms were completed. Youth movements sprang up supporting full resource sovereignty. Scholars wrote articles declaring it the dawn of an African economic revolution. Meanwhile, in mining capitals across Europe, executives gathered in rooms filled with tension. Some argued to double down on pressure, calling for sanctions or international arbitration. But others recognized a deeper truth: the world had changed. Africa was no longer the silent supplier of global industry. It was a rising power armed with minerals, ambition, and unity. Back on the continent, scenes of transformation unfolded everywhere. In bustling cities, construction cranes emerged, signaling new industrial zones. Technicians attended training programs held by visiting engineers. From Asia and the Middle East, students filled classrooms to study geology, metallurgy, robotics, environmental management, and renewable energy systems. Governments collaborated on cross-border railway projects to transport processed materials, not raw ore. Communities near former European mining sites noticed changes almost immediately. Dust clouds faded, rivers began to clear, local councils reclaimed land for agriculture, housing, or reforestation. For the first time in decades, villagers felt a sense of ownership over their surroundings. Yet the transition was not simple. New partnerships brought risks. Managing complex industrial operations required expertise that would take years to develop. Some local officials struggled to balance environmental protection with rapid economic expansion. And tensions occasionally flared when former foreign companies refused to hand over geological data or attempted to litigate their departure. But the nations remained determined. Each obstacle strengthened their resolve. Each setback reminded them why they had taken this historic leap. In think tanks across Africa, economic strategists developed bold visions: continental battery manufacturing hubs, mega refineries processing multi-country mineral streams, joint research labs studying alternative lithium sources, and regional semiconductor production lines powered by local rare earths. For the first time, Africa was planning not just how to extract minerals, but how to build industries around them. France watched as its influence dwindled. It sent more envoys, offering new terms, softer language, and acknowledgments of past mistakes. But mistrust lingered. Too many years had passed without fair compensation, without accountability, without genuine partnership. The once powerful mining giants of Europe found themselves sidelined, eclipsed by new investors who arrived without colonial baggage and with offers of shared ownership, sovereign financing, and state-of-the-art technology. Europe had assumed Africa would never demand more. That assumption had proven costly months after the expulsion. The continent held a historic summit that united resource-rich nations in a pact to regulate mineral exports and coordinate industrialization strategies. Delegates signed agreements to stabilize regional markets, protect the environment, limit predatory competition, and speak collectively in negotiations with foreign buyers. The pact marked a turning point. No longer would African nations undercut each other for scraps in foreign deals. They would negotiate as equals, stronger, prouder, and united. As the summit concluded, the world realized that Africa had rewritten the global mineral order. France, once a dominant player, now found itself negotiating from a place of vulnerability. It struggled to secure new deals that complied with the continent's standards. Its companies restructured, downsizing operations that once seemed untouchable. Its diplomats spoke candidly about rebuilding trust rather than exerting influence. But in mining towns across Africa, the sense of renewal was profound. New companies owned by locals began to manage sites once operated by foreign giants. Villagers gathered to watch as the first entirely African-run mineral convoys rolled out under their nation's flag. Markets expanded, roads improved, skilled jobs multiplied. Schools received funding from mineral revenues once lost to offshore accounts. A new generation grew up witnessing something their parents never saw. African nations choosing their future instead of having it chosen for them. In time, even the global narrative shifted. What began as a story of conflict and expulsion became a case study. In empowerment and economic transformation, international organizations acknowledged the necessity of the shift, noting that resource sovereignty was essential for sustainable development. As for France, it eventually recognized that the era of dominance had ended. It adapted slowly, painfully, but inevitably. New partnerships, based on equality rather than entitlement, began to emerge. The relationship between Europe and Africa, once mired in history, gradually evolved into something healthier, and across the continent, leaders reflected on the journey. They knew challenges remained. Industrialization was a long and complex path. Environmental risks required vigilance. Governance demanded transparency. But they also understood that the hardest part, the reclamation of dignity and control, was already achieved. No longer would Africa's wealth be shipped away while its people remained poor. No longer would foreign companies treat the continent as an extraction site. No longer would old powers assume eternal privilege. The world had changed, and Africa had changed with it, this time on its own terms. What began as an expulsion became a rebirth. And as new mines opened under African management, as refineries lit up the night sky with a glow of innovation, as young scientists conducted research in laboratories funded by mineral wealth once stolen, one truth resonated across the continent. Africa was no longer waiting for permission. Africa was leading.